please.
Good afternoon, everybody. So it was nice to meet you yesterday morning as well. And so it's really great to be here and share with you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing, that my organization has been doing with indigenous peoples in South America. So I work for an organization called Amazon Conservation Team. It's an NGO that works with indigenous people in the countries currently of Colombia, Suriname, and Brazil to protect their ancestral lands and the rainforests that they inhabit. So basically, I would love to share with you some of my observations on the state of indigenous mapping as one of the conversations that's taking place in participatory mapping. As we all know, it's a pretty big tent. Participatory mapping and indigenous mapping is one of those conversations. I'd like to begin by sort of acknowledging that, so I speak from the South American context, because even in indigenous mapping, you might think is a very specialized field. We still tend to get kind of siloed in our respective areas, you know, like in South America. We tend to talk to each other in South America a lot, but don't often have dialogue with people working on indigenous mapping elsewhere. So for example, in Canada, there's a really great tradition of indigenous mapping as well. And I'm sure that here in Scandinavia with the Sami people, there is as well. But in South America, some of the observations or some of the origins of indigenous mapping kind of started in this way. The reason why I showed this picture is because we have to frequently start from the point of nothing when it comes to useful maps. If you look at the Amazon rainforest on Google Maps, on Bing Maps, on any of these kinds of available platforms, you frequently don't really see much that's of use to indigenous people. Or if you do see something, you see frequently colonial names that were given by the colonizers when they first settled in the region. Obviously, some of the countries have some of those names, like Colombia, which is named after Christopher Columbus. And so when it comes to working with indigenous people, we frequently have to start by making our own maps, or better put, working with the communities to help them make their own maps, and therefore it's participatory mapping. So that's one of the first observations that we have. So frequently, like even something like OpenStreetMap isn't useful to us, and so we have to start by working with the communities in that sense. So that's something that's kind of unique to South America. The other thing about indigenous mapping is that, at least in South America, it started as kind of a political pursuit. So, you know, there is, of course, land management planning, there's natural resource planning, but the most important thing that a lot of these maps have contributed to are political processes having to do with land titling and land rights to the communities that frequently don't have rights to the places where they inhabit. So these maps, for example, so obviously this was done in the this is actually 1989 when this map was produced prior to the emergence of GIS technology. And what my organization has done is to work with communities to sort of actualize these maps in a more GIS format so that this can be a tool, a very powerful tool that can be used, for example, in the court setting for communities to negotiate their land rights, or if there's incursions that take place in their lands from corporations that were given out a concession in their lands without the full consent of these communities, they then have tools to protect their territory and prevent that from taking place or taking it to court. So for us, participatory mapping has a very kind of political sort of nature, and frequently this comes out of the tradition of counter mapping or critical mapping as well. So 2 years ago, just to sort of, I have a couple of disjointed observations that I hope will kind of connect together. So Greg in his keynote mentioned that 2 years ago we had this workshop on indigenous mapping. I was at that workshop as well, and he mentioned a couple of things that were sort of themes that came out of that. So one had to do with engagement, sort of getting the community as involved as possible, the indigenous communities, because frequently what happens is, and I'm sure that this is kind of similar in maybe the urban areas as well, when it comes to participatory mapping, is it's only partially participatory. So for example, in the data collection phase, so working with communities to show them how to use GPS technologies or smartphone tools to help them map their lands. In the data collection phase, it's very participatory, but when it comes to the later phases, for example, producing the maps, that's where it kind of ends, and that's where the organizations tend to take over when it comes to the map making. So it's a very kind of incomplete participatory process. And so one of the things that we've been trying to work on and trying to think through, and that's something that we discussed 2 years ago as well, is how can we make that more complete and more participatory? And so one of the comments that I had thinking about yesterday's panel, you know, there was the question of technology, right? And now we have this proliferation of technology, democratization of technology. Is that a good thing? And when it comes to the context where we work, it's absolutely a good thing, because what we can do now is to co-design some of these tools and softwares together with communities so that it better benefits their specific needs. So in our sense, technology has been very kind of useful, and one of the things that a lot of organizations have been working on is in trying to do that and sitting down with communities and seeing how they adapted technology to their specific contexts. So that's something that's been really kind of useful in our experience. Kind of a side point to that is sort of, well, we work in the Amazon and there's no internet access. So many of the tools actually that have to do with participatory mapping are not accessible to us, you know? Many of the base maps, many of the survey tools, ArcGIS, Google, you name it, these are not things that we can really use. So in many cases, we kind of have to build our own tools or sort of adapt open source APIs or different things and kind of adapt them. And another kind of like sort of philosophical point about that is having to do also with the question of data ownership. So for many communities, it's kind of uncomfortable knowing that the data is existing somewhere in the cloud. You know, I've had it literally be described to me as it's leaving the territory and departing to somewhere else, and in that sense, it's kind of violating the sacred nature of the knowledge that is embedded in maps like these. So something like Google or something like Open Data Kit, where it has to be sent somewhere, is frequently problematic for indigenous communities. So actually keeping things entirely offline has been kind of useful to us. And so for that reason, we've in many cases had to build our own tools that can work and function in an entirely offline context. So technology has been sort of really useful for that. I just want to make a few points about data ownership and privacy. That's come up a few times at this conference as well. You can imagine that with the data that we're dealing with, that's a huge concern for communities. And the point that I wanted to make about that is, so we talked about the software and the offline thing, but there's also kind of, you know, this question of big data in terms of like the new technologies that are proliferating that are sort of in some ways, you know, nowadays you're starting to have OpenStreetMap where it's possible for people to kind of identify features of a village of an indigenous community and draw that on there. You've got satellite imagery as well that's sort of proliferating and showing locations of indigenous communities. In the Amazon, you have isolated communities still that are not in contact with the Western world and would like to remain that way. And then using satellite imagery, you can actually identify where those communities are. And then what you can find is in OpenStreetMap, some people have actually drawn in those communities, for example. So there's some interesting like questions about big data and sort of the proliferation of some of this materials that is now available online that's like rapidly increasing, and there's implications to that. I once was at a panel with a satellite imagery company that was present, where somebody actually raised some of these questions about, you know, is it responsible to be releasing so much satellite imagery, you know, given that indigenous communities might not be entirely consenting to their locations and some of their land use being shown on maps. And the person from the satellite imagery company said, well, the way that we view it is that given all of the threats that the world is facing today around climate change, around deforestation, if there's somebody out there that's changing the world or in some kind of a way, the entire global community deserves to know about it. Which to me was just such a profound, loaded statement with so many assumptions built into it around, you know, thorny questions about consent and whether the communities are aware of that kind of thing. I've also had once experience where somebody traveled with us, a researcher went to an indigenous community and collected a little bit of data while they were there of like, you know, where the meeting house was of that community and things like this. And then later when he went back home, he put that on OpenStreetMap. And I found that one day and I was like, okay, that's interesting. This is relatively benign, if you will. It's not the location of some sacred site, but it still wasn't done with consent, right? So the reason why I bring some of these up is because I think, you know, as we start to think about big data, obviously we all know about the Facebooks and the Googles who have this sort of philosophy of oversharing, if you will. But these are going to be concerns that prop up much more, you know, as these technologies evolve when it comes to working with indigenous communities that are not, in some cases don't give consent, and in other cases are not able to give consent to essentially data about them being shared in a public way. So with that, there's also just very briefly to mention the epistemology of data. This is something that I get asked a lot and actually would love to open this up to conversation because I never have an answer about whether it's possible to map worldviews that are not of a Western nature, but mapping them in a Cartesian plane, if you will. So using like maps to represent sort of non-Western worldviews is something that I get asked a lot, and whether that's problematic. And so actually this is where I want to ask the experts in the room what they think on this subject when it comes to something like that. And I think with that, I'll close. I have many more thoughts, but essentially, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about some of the things that we think about in Indigenous mapping, and hopefully get some of your thoughts and feedback. So thank you. I can start.
Yeah.
Because I have many dreams on this subject, actually. And it goes down to what I was saying earlier about co-design of the tools with the communities themselves as much as possible. You know, as the software is being developed, having community members being present to actually give input on what the tools are supposed to do to the greatest extent possible. So we've been trying to do that a little bit as well, just trying to show people the tools that we're developing as they go along so that it's not a delivered product that the community starts to use at the end stage, but that they're there from the very beginning with the technologists, with the software developers, so that some of those things can be addressed. That's sort of my dream, that the communities, and then there's more ownership in the tool as well, because it's something that they've realized that they've kind of had a stake in designing. So I think that's really essential for that. We'll say that, for example, in the Amazon, there's a lot of data loss happening in the form of traditional knowledge that's passing with each generation that goes. A lot of the kind of orally passed down knowledge that is disappearing. And so their work can be done. Mapping is one of those ways that you can capture some of that data, right? So in that sense, it's creating, or it's documenting meaningful data that can continue to live on in the community by documenting it. So just to give an example of yes, sometimes data and capturing data can be very good. I can just say very quickly 2 reasons why I think sometimes participatory might be more problematic. So one is insofar if you're working with like small local communities, if you're soliciting more participation, you're also soliciting more politics on behalf of those people that are participating. And sometimes those people have very loud voices. And in that case, that voice gets channeled more than the other people that are participating. So you're opening yourself up to that. But maybe I can also be a little bit more controversial and say that there's perhaps like an ideological assumption that participatory is always a good thing, because to echo your point, there are some cultures where there are certain structures in place about how decisions are made. And if you're going in already assuming that, you know, including everybody as much as possible, the women, the children, the men, everybody, every single demography from the outset, you might be violating some of those sensitive structures about how decisions are made on a local basis. So it's always important to kind of be aware of what those structures are before deciding even, like to first of all take a participatory approach, and again, what participatory means in that context. So I would say that.